Mia Amato, and I'm here to talk with Janet Nicholson about what life was like growing up in South Africa during the most turbulent years of apartheid. So, to start off, could you just tell us a little bit of background about where you were born and when?
Sure. I was born in 1971 in Pretoria, which is close to Johannesburg, and I came over to the United States in 1993 when I finished my college back home to visit my father's sister, and I came over for a year on a student visa and went to KU for that year.
And living in Pretoria, were your parents pretty affluent?
Living in Pretoria, we lived right outside of a military base. My dad was a colonel in the army, and it was during the apartheid era. I grew up in a white neighborhood. We were middle class, upper class, but compared to the oppressed African people, we were considered wealthy.
Did you have any servants?
We had a maid and a gardener that worked in the gardener worked in the garden, did all the weeding, whatever my mom and dad asked him to do. Our maid was there on a few days a week. As I got older, when we were younger, we had a maid that helped look after us every day. And so I grew up not having to make my bed, tidy my room, or clean a toilet. And I had to learn all that when I came to the United States.
Because you were around your maid so often, did you have a close relationship with her?
Yes, I did. The maid that we had when we were very young, her name was Esther. I can't remember when she stopped working for us. I think we moved. But we had in our preteen years and teenage years, we had a maid called Letty, and she stayed with another lady close to our neighborhood, and then she came in Tuesdays and Thursdays. The way that it was set up in South Africa was that the houses in the white neighborhoods had to have a servant's quarters because they lived in the locations, and they had to travel great distances to get into the white neighborhoods to work.
Townships.
Townships, yes. And so a lot of times they would be staying in the servants' quarters and working for the white people during the week. Their children would be taken care of by grandparents in the locations. And that's just the way it was, and we never questioned it, didn't know any better. My generation, it was just the way it was.
And because you were around them so often as a child, were you taught to treat them differently as you grew older?
It's weird saying it now, but growing up in South Africa, my generation, you always knew that you were privileged because you had a white skin. So a black person would always be considered a servant and doing servant duties. We did treat them with respect, though, or at least we did, because we were taught to grow up kind and courteous, but so we did respect them. Not everybody did, though.
Yeah, it was just something that was accepted.
It was completely accepted that a black person in South Africa was a servant and was not allowed the same privileges as a white person.
So there were a lot of uprisings in 1986 when you were about 14, 15. How were you taught to view these laws of apartheid? Were you told that they were good, or how did you
not
view
necessarily. The uprising that you're speaking of, I don't even remember it. I think we were completely oblivious from those sorts of things. We grew up in our sheltered area, so those sorts of uprisings, if they took place in the townships, we had they didn't affect us at all.
And your dad was a colonel in the army, you said, right?
Yes.
So he must have been aware that some of these events were happening, but it was never discussed
No, we didn't
Okay,
discuss it
okay.
because we,
It was just kept separate.
it was just kept separate, and it wasn't as if my parents were keeping a secret. I
Mhm.
don't. They probably didn't even really know. My dad maybe, but it was, again, he grew up in South Africa. His growing up in South Africa, same thing. We knew that the world had sanctions on against South Africa
Okay.
because of apartheid. But it was always considered, well, nobody else understands
Oh, okay.
what it's like here, but in South Africa. But so you didn't grow up questioning it. We knew that we didn't take part in the Olympic Games because there were sanctions on the country. No, none of that was taught to us. Wasn't considered wrong.
Mhm.
We grew up, our schools, if our mother tongue was English, our first language was English, and we had to take Afrikaans as well.
Yes.
If your mother tongue was Afrikaans, then you would take Afrikaans as your first language, and English as your second language. And if you failed either of those, then you failed the grade. So every white child grew up speaking English and Afrikaans fluently.
Yeah. No. I remember learning in class how most of the students were forced to learn Afrikaans. And this was particularly difficult for the black students because most of the teachers didn't even know how to speak it in the first place.
Because English is the international language and everybody wants to speak English. No, I know.
Yeah.
So I grew up going to a white English school for my primary school years, and then high school was white English girls boarding school. Not everybody went to boarding school though. Afrikaans schools were separate from the English schools, which was separate from the Indian schools, which were separate then from the black schools.
So because everything was separated, because, the apartheid laws, do you ever have any interactions with people of race?
Not really.
Besides your
No,
gardener or
you
maid?
would only really have interactions with black adults because they were working for you or they were the caretakers at your schools. The boarding school I went to had a whole black staff that worked in the kitchen, and that was accepted, and you just didn't know any better, or ignorance, I guess.
And I'm just curious, when did you learn about Nelson Mandela? Because you said you didn't know.
No, I grew up not knowing who Nelson Mandela was at all. It was kind of funny because my cousins that grew up in the United States knew all about him. And when he was due to be released in South Africa, I remember asking my mom, who is Nelson Mandela? And she said, oh, he's a communist. Because, see, that's what we were taught. But he was released, and I remember it was the National Party that was in power, and was I there for the first vote? No, I was there for the voting when I was 18 to vote. All the white people were allowed to vote to say, yes, let's go forward with a whole democracy for the country.
Okay.
So that's what we did. I remember voting for that, and I remember distinctly the very conservative parties and the more liberal parties. And
was that when de Klerk was in office?
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, that was when he was in office.
Okay.
Yes.
And so then when you came to America, what was it like?
It was interesting because we grew up with watching American movies, but we had the idea that the black people in America were more educated. They were, that's a whole different. We would consider that, oh well, that's different. It's different in South Africa. People don't understand that our black people aren't educated. That's how we grew up knowing. So when I came to the United States, it was very eye-opening for me. It didn't take very long before I realized, oh, now I see. Now I understand what the whole uproar against apartheid is. Because if apartheid was never set in place, our black population would be just as educated as the black population here, and because of that apartheid, that was a consequence. driving around and seeing bumper stickers on cars that would say not negative things about the government or the president at the time in this country, maybe joking about it. I could not believe that you were allowed to do that, because growing up in South Africa, we were not allowed to speak out against the government and question it, which is one reason why my father's sister and her husband left the country, because my uncle was very liberal and did not want his children growing up under apartheid. He needed them to grow up in a much different atmosphere.
Yeah, where
So
you had
he was considered a radical at the time, and he went to Wits University in Johannesburg and was part of a rebellious movement against the government. So he decided he would leave because it wasn't worth it for his children to grow up with that. So, but other things that I noticed here that were very fascinating to me was everybody can go to any public place. Where in South Africa growing up, I would catch the bus into the center of Pretoria to go to my college, which was a technicon, and we called white buses, and there were black buses and white buses. And growing up and going to the beaches, there were white beaches and black beaches. There were even benches that would say whites only. There were bathrooms, white bathrooms, black bathrooms. Movie theaters.
Everything was separated.
Everything was in movie theaters. You were all white, and so it was. So those are definitely the very first things that I noticed, that they aren't. There were those signs that said.
And do you see any similarities? Because we did have a strong civil rights movement, and we used to segregate people ourselves, especially in the South. So, do you see any similarities with racial prejudice?
Not really. There's so much. There's much more open racial prejudice in South Africa.
Even now?
Even now, I'm not there long enough on a day-to-day basis, but people, some of my Afrikaans friends that are more conservative, easily will, speak about black people stealing or doing this, doing that, without even giving it a second thought. And maybe they are upset because there is so much theft, because they feel like they've worked hard for their, paying for their houses and their lights and water, electricity, all that stuff, and it gets stolen. But it's a bigger picture, I think.
Yeah.
You have to look at the bigger picture. It's easier for me to say I don't live in the country, but...
Were you aware at all of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee?
I knew that the Truth and Reconciliation Committee was going on. I don't really know all the details.
Okay.
That wasn't too much of my experience growing up. I think more my experiences were, growing up being taught that way, not knowing any better than...
So now when you go and visit South Africa, do you notice any progress or change?
I do a little bit. There's such a big, it's going to take generations, I think, for it to work, because my generation of black people in South Africa were oppressed, and they didn't have an education. They went to their schools in their locations. I don't think they were very good at all. A lot of them didn't finish high school, so they don't have an education, and I think they're angry, and which is understandable. So do I see progress when I go back? There's a lot of crime as a result, but that's because of the anger, I think, and there's a lot of uneven rich people, poor people, and when you go to South Africa, you recognize so quickly that there's people in such poverty that are right at the grocery store, the minute you park your car, that come up to you asking for money like this, and trying to sell coat hangers or so, just for money, or that sort of thing. We don't see it in this country unless we go to the the poorer area,
like Detroit or
into those neighborhoods. But you see it on your
NBC.
yes, you see it on. I remember when Kaylin was 4. No, she was 2. I'm sorry, 2 or 4. I can't remember. When we were there, somebody rang the doorbell, and my mom still lives in my childhood home, and it was, I think it was a black man, poor black man, asking if we had any old clothes, and my mom always keeps a stash of old clothes so she can hand, and then they ask for money, and then my mom would make a big sandwich for him, like canned food, and have him sit on the front step and eat that if he wanted to. And Kaylin said, but what about his dessert? And my mom burst out laughing because, you know, dessert is so far from his mind, right? He just needed clothes and nourishment. Mm-hmm. So I mean, my children in this country growing up in not understanding true poverty until they go to South Africa.
So do you think it's important when they visit?
Yes, definitely. Well, now South Africa has the issue of the immigrants that come over the borders from Northern Africa and Central Africa. And so the last time we went home, 2 years ago, my mom is very active in her church with volunteering and helping underprivileged people. So there is these squatters come over the border and set up camps they make makeshift houses out of cardboard and corrugated iron and rocks on the roofs to hold down, no running water, no electricity. And the one we went to visit, that my mom's church started a preschool in the middle of this squatter camp of 14,000 people right outside the neighborhood that I grew up in. Yes. And the social worker from my mom's church took us in there, and my kids could see that these people have made themselves homes out of this. And you know what's interesting is all the little children had big smiling faces and were so happy to see us. And I have a picture of Kaylin with her long blonde hair, and the little kids were pulling her hair and playing with her hair because they'd never seen that before.
Oh.
Moms would be walking around with the babies strapped to their backs, carrying buckets of water on their head because they would have to go to a central point to get their water for the day, bathing water, drinking water, and then carrying bags with bread. And I had to point that out to the kids to say, see how these people live? And you guys waste so much food. So yes, it's very important for my children to go. A lot of homeless people, children as well, homeless children.
Must be hard to see.
Yeah. But what I've noticed now, this is an interesting thing. Growing up, you never saw homeless white people. Now you do. Now you see homeless white people, because the balance is slowly starting to happen. So people, even white people that didn't have a good education or college education, are now competing and not finding jobs like you. So you do see homeless white people standing on the side. Never saw that in apartheid.
So when you came to America, did you ever run into misconceptions about you?
Yes. This is a funny one. Somebody joked and said, "But aren't you the wrong color?" And I said, "No, actually, no." So, any misconceptions about me? I think, you know what? I think I was very sensitive towards that. Worried that people would think that I was racist, especially if people, everywhere I went, people would say, "Where are you from? Your accent." My accent's not as strong now as it was. And if I'd be at the grocery store and it was a black person asking, part of me would cringe because I'm thinking, please don't think that I'm, and I'd say South Africa. Except I had a very positive reaction from everybody to say, "Oh, how cool, what is it like?" And I could speak about, the seasons are different, it's a different hemisphere, all those sorts of things. I didn't, so I made it my goal that once I started having children, I never want them to judge anybody by the color of their skin, the clothes that they wear, the way that they look. I just made it my goal that my children are going to grow up questioning things, and us providing all the information to them and having them make their own decisions on what they want to do, who they want to vote for. And that goes across the board: religion, race, cultural, everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I made it my goal that it would break my heart if my children would judge people because they are different in any way, shape, or form. Because I've learned that I think that you judge when you're afraid and you don't know everything about that. It's easy to judge and say, I don't like those people because they eat different food to me, or they believe in something different, they look different from us. And that's so wrong. Because I teach my children that if you don't take the time to become friends and learn about people with different races, cultures, backgrounds, how boring would your life be?
Yeah.
It makes life so rich that we all come from different places, and yeah. So that was kind of my goal after that was, I didn't want people to perceive me as a racist white person coming from South Africa.
Yeah. So what do you think of the future of South Africa with regards to race, I guess, and how people might be?
Well, I think that there are people in the government in South Africa, and unfortunately, that are not honest, and they take care of themselves but make big promises to all their people. Corruption. That's what I'm trying to say. It's a big problem in South Africa. In fact, in a lot of the African countries, even the police force in South Africa are also very corrupt. Because my brother, who tells me that if you get pulled over by a policeman, if you tell them you'll go to the ATM and draw money for them, they won't write you a ticket, and it's just something that they do. The corruption, I think, is not not good. So there still continue to be huge portions of the population that don't have lights and water, that were made huge promises if they voted for the ANC. They would have all this stuff, and it hasn't happened. Nelson Mandela was a great man. I think it's unfortunate because I don't think the country actually really did what he stood for. Unfortunately, I think the tribal cultures are still very strong in the people, and they believe that they can have several wives, and that women are mistreated really badly. And these are people that are in our government, or in South Africa's government. So unfortunately, I don't know. And the economy's suffering. So that's unfortunate because it's a beautiful country. So how is it ever going to sort itself out? I still just think it's going to take generations.
Do you notice anything different about the way these government officials are elected?
The whole way of voting is different from ours in the United States. When my parents came to visit once, it was before one of the elections, and my parents were really interested because each political candidate here has to sort of sell themselves, where in South Africa it's not like that. You vote for a party, and then the party will then decide who is going to be the president.
Okay.
Which I don't know, I think is unfortunate, because if that person isn't truthful, and it's not, I would like to see them having to sell themselves to the nation and have tell everybody what their agenda is,
so that you feel like you're really voting for them and really getting your say.
Exactly.
Okay.
But I don't know. I don't know all the details, but it's going to take a long time, I think.
Would you ever like to move back to South Africa?
My answer right out is no. I love the country. It's my home. It's my home where I grew up in. I miss the food. Who doesn't miss the food they grew up with? I miss the food that I grew up with. But you know what? I've changed too much. When I go back and I hear the way some people talk, I see the huge, differences. I can't. I don't know. I wouldn't want my children to. Yes, the United States has their issues, but there's so much more. I don't know. The kids can go further with their educations. There's not, no, I wouldn't go back. Even though my mom is still there, my brothers, all my relatives are there. I would, as long as Matt's here, and even if anything happened to Matt, I would still stay here, because this is what my kids know. It's a big difference. It's a huge difference for them coming from this going to that versus going from that coming to this.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to thank you so much for your time. It's very interesting to hear the story from your perspective.
You're welcome. I hope it's been helpful.
Yeah.
And like I say, just I don't know everything. This is just my little perspective. So.
So, have you been to Nandos over here?
Yes, I have.
Have you tasted
love Nandos.
peri-peri chicken? And
Yes, I have, because in South Africa, it's funny, there's a Nando's almost in every corner. It's more of a fast food restaurant, though. My brother goes to Nando's almost every day for lunch. So they're usually like a little hole in the wall, and you go in, you stand at the counter, although you can sit. I think you can sit at Nando's, but it's fast food. You know, it's considered fast food. So when Nando's opened here, I was so excited, but it seems very fancy here compared to what it is in South Africa. Yes, the Nando's, I wish the food was less expensive, though, for what you get at Nando's, because it's not like that in South Africa. I mean, it tastes the same, but when I order chicken, I got like a piece of chicken and a little vegetable, and I'm like, this is all you get?